mental, that 6 million people in this country have depression or crippling anxiety, and that 3/4 of them go untreated. The wealthier we get, the unhappier we seem to be, they say, and they make an economic as well as medical case for expanding mental health treatment. First of all, is this true, or are we merely medicalising the glum, the shy and the badly behaved? Maybe, in our blame-resistant times, relieving them of being moral agents for their own behaviour. If it is true, oughtn't we to address the underlying causes of such widespread distress, rather than, or at least as well as, trying to drug and talk them out of it? Try to glue back an atomising society, rebuild broken families, raise our ambitions beyond vapid consumerism, perhaps rediscover religion? Shouldn't we try to work out what makes us happy and put it on the school curriculum? Are we really less able to cope than previous generations? What does it say about us, and how can we make it better? That's our moral maze tonight. The panel: Melanie Phillips, social commentator on the Daily Mail, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, and Matthew Taylor, formerly Tony Blair's chief political advisor, now chief executive of the RSA. Claire Fox, does this report make sense to you?
I'm afraid it doesn't, because my dread is that what we're doing is labelling problems of everyday life with syndromes and pathologies, and I get nervous that in the course of doing that we're trivialising serious clinical depression and mental illness, because we basically get to the point where every little bit of unhappiness is described as though it's mental illness.
Melanie Phillips?
I think there undoubtedly is a certain amount of inappropriate categorisation going on, categorising ordinary unhappiness as mental disorder of some kind or another. But I also think that there is undoubtedly a real increase in real mental illness, depression, anxiety. I think these things are increasing because of the pressures of everyday life, undoubtedly. But nevertheless, the idea that social problems or social pressures don't in their own way lead to clinical illness, I think that view, putting these things in alternative boxes, is not realistic at all.
Michael Portillo?
Well, I think mental illnesses like depression clearly do exist, but there are incentives to classify things like unhappiness or misfortune as ill health. There are powerful lobby groups pushing in that direction, and a diagnosis can be a passport to benefits and to treatment. And then I think some unhappy people may find it reassuring to be diagnosed as ill.
Matthew Taylor?
I think there are real issues about the scale of sadness and fear in society. I think we can imagine reasons for that, but I worry about the analysis that lies behind and the consequences of defining that problem in medical terms, and particularly on the scale that the LSE report suggests.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Professor Lord Layard, Richard Layard, who's Director of the Wellbeing Programme at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, and the man behind this report. What interested me, Lord Layard, was that you say mental illness in the report. Mental illness is a far more important cause of unhappiness than, say, broken families or any other social, economic or cultural cause, almost as if mental illness had nothing to do with those underlying
No, of course
issues.
It influences those things. What I'm trying to establish is that this is a deep underlying problem for many people in our country, and to look at its importance, we include, when we're trying to explain whether people are satisfied or not with their lives, things like their family situation, their job situation, and so on. We also include their physical health, we include their income. And then we include not their current mental illness, because that's obviously begging the question, but their mental illness 8-10 years earlier, their mental scale, how they were on a mental scale of malaise. And that is the dominating influence affecting how miserable a person is now. 4 times more powerful than their current income, and twice as powerful as how many physical illnesses they have. So this is a root dimension of the human situation, which we have not been willing to take seriously. I think because we've not been willing to think it could be studied in a scientific way. Now, I'm an economist, I'm from outside this world, but what has really impressed me is the quality of the science with which these people operate, both in the diagnosis, which is done scientific, so not self-diagnosis. There's no incentive of anybody to diagnose themselves. They're diagnosed by a researcher.
Let me stop you there, because you've already said several things that I think the panel will want to unpack. Michael Portillo?
Well, the 6 million figure is a pretty surprising one, and I must say it does provoke a certain amount of scepticism. How are we defining mental illness?
Well, it's defined by asking people an awful lot of questions about themselves, how they feel, how they're sleeping, eating, and all these other things.
And you think a sort of poll like that is reliable, do you?
Yes, of course. It's an interview survey. Now,
but there's a big difference between unhappiness and mental illness,
You're asking a reasonable question. Where should the cut-off be put? And the point is that having put a cut-off, they then differentiate within the cut-off between mild, moderate and severe. So if you take severe depression, of course that's less than the whole of depression. But the remarkable thing is that if you take the whole of depression in these surveys and you compare it with the impact of angina, asthma, diabetes, arthritis on a person's functioning, I'm going to be quite practical in a minute. Talking about their functioning, can they work, can they run a family, can they get up in the morning? It is 50% more disabling. Depression, that whole spectrum of it.
Well, I think depression is very disabling from everyone I've known who has it. But I think a lot of people who do have depression will be pretty shocked by what you've just said. Because what you're really saying is that you're accepting that people who describe themselves as unhappy have mental ill health. I mean, that seems to me deeply unfair to people who have depression, which, as you say, is a debilitating condition.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm talking about the depression. There are people who ask these detailed questions, and then they are classified. One classification is depression. Another classification is anxiety disorders, like these MPs who came out last week, obsessive-compulsive disorder,
but you
and
used
so
an
on.
expression yourself in your first answer, satisfied with their life. Well, lots of people may not be satisfied with their life. Doesn't mean they've got clinical depression, does it? I mean, there may be all sorts of reasons for unhappiness, including that life isn't going very well.
Michael, you didn't understand what I said. I said, if we want to say what are the causes of misery, we need a measure of what is misery. And I'm saying to be in, let's say, the bottom quarter of people who are least satisfied with their lives. And then we see what explains it. And I'm saying, if we run an equation putting in all the different factors, one of the factors which comes through dominant
you're doing it by self-definition.
is this malaise.
You're doing it by self-definition. You're asking people whether they feel depressed. I mean, that surely isn't the definition of whether someone has depression.
I'm not asking them whether they feel depressed. I'm asking them 26 questions and producing a score as a result of it, which is their score on this index of malaise, which is what is this overwhelming predictor of whether a person 8 years later says they're satisfied with their life or not.
Matthew Taylor?
Richard, as you said, you were a more conventional economist before you got into the area of happiness and well-being. If I could imagine taking you back to the kind of 1960s and saying to you that there'll be a future time when 6 or 7 million people who wanted full-time jobs couldn't get it, where living standards had been stagnant for 20 or 30 years and inequality was at an all-time high, and that lots and lots of people in that society were anxious and depressed, do you think you would have needed a medical explanation for that, or would you simply have said, well, of course they would be?
Well, I'm not wanting to get too much into this historical thing which you brought in the introduction. I think mental illness has actually been a feature of the human situation from the old Stone Age. And the great thing now is that we're able to understand it much better and treat it. So what I'm wanting to say to you, Matthew, is that we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of people who are unhappy. They're unhappy because they haven't got jobs. They're unhappy because they haven't got a proper housing situation. They don't understand their benefit situation. There are 1,000 things that are wrong in society, which you and I have worked on before. And I've spent most of my life working on unemployment inequality and not mental health. What has struck me, though, is that in spite of big improvements, I mean, you're wrong to say that everything's been getting worse over the last 30 years, apart from in this current recession. Most of the typical indicators that Beveridge would have looked at, standards of education, housing, income, and so on, absolute income, have improved a lot. But what has struck me and what has got me into this field is the fact that we know from the surveys that happiness has not increased, and I do believe... I think the reason why happiness has not improved, in spite of all these improvements in the external circumstances of our society, is that we haven't given enough attention to the inner people. What is going on inside?
Can I just then explore the consequences? I know that you advocate talking therapies rather than drug interventions. But can I just ask you a thought experiment? If there was an effective drug intervention, as effective as cognitive behavioural therapy, which is what you do advocate, do you think 6 million of us should be taking those drugs?
No, because some of them are mild, and I quite agree with what Michael was saying.
But you're advocating talking therapies for all these people.
There is a turnover rate, especially with depression, actually, that depression is an episodic illness.
But I thought the top line of your report was that 6 million people should be treated. That was the top line of your report, wasn't it? That 6 million people are in need of treatment.
They should be getting some help, but I can only react in the light of the current drug situation. Really, I can't do a hypothetical situation. At the moment, mild and moderate depression should not be treated with drugs. That's a nice recommendation. But I think all the people
all had drugs, we all had cognitive behavioural therapy.
People would benefit from psychological therapy. Every one of them.
But if we had the drugs, so we had the cognitive behavioural therapy, and that meant people were more content about living in a society that was unequal, lots of unemployment, would that be a better situation for people to be more content, regardless of how society is?
Look, it's a matter of both and. We should be improving on all fronts.
Claire Fox.
When I worked in mental health many years ago, a great source of frustration for people who had clinical depression was when the next door neighbour would say, I know what you feel, I'm fed up and miserable too.
Yeah, exactly.
Aren't you doing the same? Aren't you institutionalising that very trivialisation of serious depression when you say lack of life satisfaction, angst, and so on and so forth?
No, I think we've still gone back to the same confusion. Well, I'm not using lack of life satisfaction as equivalent to mental illness. I'm saying mental illness is a very important factor explaining it.
Okay. I'm simply saying you've talked about unhappiness. I'd say that there is no evidence of an increase in a decline in mental illness unless you start talking about life satisfaction, unhappiness, and labelling being fed up with a medical label. And you're the one doing that, not me.
No, but I as I said earlier, I'm very against the idea of an epidemic of depression. I don't think there's any very clear evidence that there's more mental illness now than there was 50 years ago.
Well, that's a good headline for us.
But I think it is a deep and enduring human problem which we are now becoming able to deal with because we have scientifically experimented with what therapies make a difference and what don't, and we are measuring the outcomes, and we are seeing people's lives turned around. All the people.
I've got one last chance to ask you something, so I just want to do it very quick. You just said in response to Matthew that you think that all of those people would benefit from going to therapy. Can I just ask you, if you go to therapy, you're a patient, you're dependent, you have to go to somebody else to solve your problems. Do you not think that chips away at self-confidence and resilience if you are told that the only way you can tackle any problems is to go to an expert who's going to sort out what's going on inside you?
Well, I think that what most of these people would say they had got from the therapy was they felt they had regained control over their lives. And that is certainly the aim of all good therapists. But just coming back to your numbers, the program we are providing at the moment aims by 2014 to treat 15% of those 6 million. So I'm not thinking they will all want to be treated. And you asked me a definitional question. I think they would benefit, but I'm sure we will never get to a situation where more than a third of them are actually being treated. We probably don't need to, because of the turnover, the natural recovery, and many things.
Professor Leon, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, thank you.
Our next witness is Dr. Kenneth McLaughlin, who's Senior Lecturer at the Research Institute for Health and Social Change at Manchester Metropolitan University. Do you accept that so many, 6 million I think was the headline, are mentally ill? And if you don't, what's going on here in your view?
Well, I think sort of part of the problem is that it can be very difficult to know with clarity the true extent of the problem. I mean, there's certainly been an exponential rise in diagnostic criteria over the past 40 years. And I suppose the more criteria you have, the more people you can fit into them. For example, does the demand for therapy lead to the supply of therapists? Or is the reverse the case? Does the supply of therapists lead to the demand for therapy? Neither, I think, is the situation helped by the way that much research uses terms such as mental illness, mental disorder, mental health problems interchangeably. And mental health problems is used a very elastic term to such an extent that almost any unpleasant behaviour or experience can be classified as such.
I understand exactly what you're saying. It's a very telling point. Melanie Phillips.
Given what you just said about the imprecision of the definitions, what evidence do you think there is for the belief that a number of social problems are being inappropriately diagnosed as mental illness?
I do certainly believe that people are more anxious about a variety of things today. I don't sort of doubt that. But I would argue that this has got less to do with individual pathology than the way personal, social and political concerns are articulated in the current period. And I think in this sense it's really important to differentiate between two things. Certainly there's people that require professional psychological support. We need to differentiate that from the politicisation, I would say, of the politicisation of therapy, and particularly the way that moral and political claims and interventions by all the mainstream parties today, and including many campaign groups, are articulated and justified in psychological terms.
Well, that's as may be. I mean, I can agree with you that there are groups which do inappropriately classify people, but, I mean, is there necessarily a distinction to be drawn or an opposition to be made between social problems and psychological need? I mean, for example, one could say family breakdown. That is, there's been an exponential increase in mass fatherlessness. Now, in my view, my limited experience, that has given rise to a whole range of disorders, ranging from just unhappiness to what I would consider to be an illness, which is basically an inability to cope with one's life. Surely there's no contradiction between these things. One leads to the other.
No, I think there certainly is, because how you view a problem leads to how you see the solution to that problem. And if you view it as symptomatic of a mental illness or a mental disorder, then you're in the realms of seeking expert advice via our medication,
right,
or sort of talking therapies. So, for example, I don't know, if you feel low or depressed because you haven't got a job, you need a job.
Of course, but one's not talking about that. I'm talking about, for example, situations where children or young people, and again, just on the issue of family breakdown, this is one of many examples. Children have a kind of fragmentation of their personality because of the fact their families are fragmented. That leads to an inability by those children or young people to cope with life. That is an illness that has to be treated.
I think that's sort of pathologising sort of single sort of parenthood. I think what you do see when you talk about sort of children and sort of mental health problems is that, again, more and more what I would class as sort of social issues are sort of redefined as mental illnesses. So, for example, the most common form of childhood mental disorder is conduct disorder. That's the most common. The conduct disorder includes such things as aggressive behaviour, antisocial behaviour, truancy, using alcohol or using drugs. But that's not a mental illness.
Hang on a second, Melanie. Matthew Telly, your turn.
How do you think we should therefore respond to forms of social pathology like obesity or sexualisation of children or binge drinking? Are you saying, well, let's just wait for the revolution to come, because after that, then everything will be okay? I mean, what should be our response to these issues here and now? We can't simply say to these people, well, you're suffering because of the class system, can we?
Well, I think sort of what you can do is actually sort of back out a bit, because more and more what you're seeing, I think it came about quite a lot during the new Labour government that you were involved with, was more and more seeing the problematisation of informal relationships, not just within the family, but also within the community. So, for example, some of those informal forms of social support got undermined, certainly during the new Labour years. So community groups, and groups that would maybe organically respond to community need, which may be to do with social problems, more and more, to justify their funding, had to do government policy by proxy. So they weren't responding to identified local need. They were doing whatever was the government fad, whether that was around healthy eating, smoking cessation, alcohol, abuse strategies, etc.,
But
etc.
I can't quite see how you're explaining obesity on the basis that this is people's response to healthy eating campaigns. But aren't there things about modern society, aren't there aspects of modern society, whether we're talking about consumerism or inequality or whatever it is, which do make people unhappy on an individual level? Or do you simply denying the possibility of individual unhappiness?
No, I'm not. What I'm trying to say to you...
How do we deal when people do the wrong thing? What is our response to it? I don't understand how you think we should respond to social...
Let him explain.
Pathologies.
One, I think as far as possible, people should be left to come to their own solutions without expert intervention or government dictate. Well, that would normally have been seen as something to do with the sort of criminal justice system or the youth justice system or something. That wouldn't have been seen as a mental illness. What we tend to see now then is a sort of the medicalisation of crime. Sort of thing. But I tell you, one of the things that I wanted to sort of get across is what you see, how we're encouraged to view ourselves as vulnerable today. And so, in that sense, it's no surprise that some people do view themselves through the prism of mental illness.
So basically you're saying this is false consciousness. So people who say, I am unhappy, I feel anxiety, and my behaviours, whether it is overeating or overdrinking or whatever, is a consequence of that, they're suffering from massive false consciousness. You need to come along and explain to them that's not really what's going on. It's class oppression that's driving their behaviour.
No, not at all. What I'm trying to understand is where this has come from, because unless we understand where it's come from, we can't either intervene or a lot of the time not intervene. So for example, in terms of the way that some of this debate takes place around sort of moral and political claims that have led to this, there's an organisation called Platform 51. I don't know if you've heard that. That claimed recently that 60% of women were in need of psychological support because of mental disorder. It identified the symptoms were sexual promiscuity, alcohol abuse and drug abuse. Now, apart from using a very loose definition of the term, what's most interesting about Platform 51 is that up until a couple of years ago, it used to be known as the Young Women's Christian Association. They're still concerned with the same things, female sexuality and inebriation, but as the old religious, moral rhetoric has lost its hold in society, they've recast them as mental health issues.
I want to go directly on from that. So what is the impact of the changes that you see on personal responsibility? What is the effect on the moral fibre of the people who are categorised falsely where they are?
Well, I think, leading on from the Platform sort of 51 sort of scenario, I actually think in many respects this new therapeutic discourse is worse than the old religious discourse, because the YWCA, at least, that had the decency to give these women who were sort of sexually promiscuous as they were saying, drinking alcohol and using drugs, they gave them moral autonomy to make the choice. The new Platform 51, under a therapeutic discourse, doesn't even give them that moral autonomy. That behaviour is now seen as symptomatic of an underlying mental disorder.
And what is the push as you see it? I mean, I assume you don't deny that anxiety and depression exists as mental health conditions. What are the drivers towards the misallocation, the misclassification, as you see?
Well, I think social and political change and the inability to sort of define your political goals and struggles in sort of honest language. Like, for example, if Platform 51 don't like those behaviours, they should be brave enough to say it, class them as bad, and stand up to that, not recast them as psychological issues.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dr. McLaughlin. Our next and last witness, in fact, is Dr. Charlie Alcock, who's the Chief Executive Officer of a charity called MAC UK, a charity that she set up to take psychological treatment to, well, principally people like gang members on the streets, very much on their terms. Sorry, it's a very simple question. They're mad, not bad, then?
We're not saying that they're mad at all. So there's a statistic which says that 1 in 3 young people who offend have got an unmet mental health need at the time of offence. And we also know that things like clinical depression, particularly in young men, may present in a very violent and aggressive way. And it's actually quite unlikely that when a young person is wielding a knife, someone's going to stop and say, hold on a minute, is that young person struggling with mental health or with clinical depression? So what happens? That young person ends up in a justice system where we know that they're less likely to get those needs met. We work with young people on a broad spectrum.
Actually, I want to stop you there because what you've said is very interesting, and I'm sure Claire Fox would want to take it up.
Our previous witnesses just made a point that is there a danger here, particularly with young people, of denying them moral agency, or in fact giving them an excuse for poor behaviour, gang members or not?
Yeah. So young people have to be accountable for their actions, and enforcement is absolutely essential. But so is working as much as we can to prevent young people from spending years in prison or years in the justice system. So we at MAC UK would work with a young person on whatever it is that they bring. That could be mental health, it could be...
I appreciate that, but let's, because we have to deal with the mental health thing here, and that's what we're looking at. You see, you said it extraordinarily. You said 1 in 3 young offenders have got an unmet mental health. You said a statistic used. You know, my concern is where did that get plucked out of the air from? How is it that you know whether they've got an unmet mental health? And what's your diagnostic technique? We've heard about the elasticity about that.
So we don't diagnose, we work with symptoms. So a young person would come to us and we would work with that young person with whatever it is that they are seeking help for.
So let's think about this, right? You work with symptoms. You'll have seen those symptoms lists. I mean, those symptoms lists of, you know, is the young person you know bullshit, or, you know, anxious, can't sleep, surly, answers back. I mean, it sounds like every angst-ridden teenager you've ever known. If you say to young people, do you tick all the symptoms here, they're all going to look like they've got a mental health problem. Is there not a danger then that you don't know what you're doing? I mean, this is just subjective nonsense, isn't it?
We wouldn't actually assess, so we wouldn't
So the youth themselves assess?
Young people bring a need to our service.
But it's not a mental health... But who calls it a mental health need, then? Do they walk through the door and say, I've got a problem of this syndrome and anxiety and mental health need, and it's an unmet mental health need which I want you as your project? Do they say that to you?
Often not, no. So we would...
So you have to give them that label then, don't you? You decided, no?
No, absolutely not.
It comes out of the ether. Where does it come from?
So we work with a model whereby, to begin with, we run activities with young people, and at those activities there would be mental health professionals, and young people know they can access that support if they want to. We don't tell them that we think they need to.
Okay, so now I get the gist, right? So this is what... Is this correct? The young people who don't know they've got a mental health unmet need, undiagnosed, and all the rest of it, you send them off to a group of mental health experts who tell them all the symptoms that they could have. No. And they then go, oh, I've got one of those unmet mental health needs, which might be a useful way for them to self-diagnose, because then you can say, oh, that's, you know, you're one of those kids who needs help, not punishment. Is that right?
No, in the Integrate model, which we actually grew with young people from the ground up, it's about taking the presenting issues which a young person brings, and it's not about diagnosing or referring on into a mainstream mental health service. Sometimes, it's actually usually an exception, that is something which a young person might find helpful, but a lot of the time that isn't what we're seeking to do.
Melanie Phillips.
So far, in my view, so unexceptionable. I mean, what you're describing is, you know, a worthy project, but I'm not quite sure where this is leading in the context of this discussion. I mean, what conclusions are you drawing? Are you drawing the conclusion, you seem to be sort of against them being in the criminal justice system, are you drawing the conclusion that they should not be in the criminal justice system, they should not be prosecuted, that they should not be imprisoned, that they should not be punished, that they have no responsibility for their actions?
I'm absolutely not saying that,
Okay.
no. So, I can speak from my experience as a practitioner on the ground, and we work with young people who are gang involved. We absolutely believe as an organisation that there has to be justice. Young people
Right.
have to be enforced
Okay.
when they offend.
Right.
But we also have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of young people,
I understand.
whatever those needs might
Okay,
be.
so a few years ago, I think probably actually quite a number of years ago, there used to be secure institutions for young people, where young people who committed crimes were sent within the criminal justice system. They were locked up because they were a danger to others and to themselves, and they were treated. Do you think we should return to that system?
I come from a very community model, so we come from an approach at Mac UK where we make mental health services accessible to young people if they want to access them.
Do you not accept that there are young people who simply won't turn up voluntarily at a worthy organisation like yours, whose needs are so extreme and whose behaviour is so extreme that in their own interest they need to be locked up? Do you not accept that? Or are you against locking anybody up? Is that your point?
No, absolutely
So why don't you
not.
want to see a return of these very specialist institutions which dealt with the most troubled of all our young people?
I want to see services which address the needs of young people. And at Mac UK, we advocate for meeting young people on those terms and for their needs to be met by what they bring, i.e. it's about the service user, not about the service.
Michael Portillo.
I wonder if you considered the possibility that you'll cause offence to people who suffer from mental health problems. You assert on the one hand that many of these youth have unmet mental health needs, but on the other hand, you say it's not about diagnosing, you work with symptoms. You give the impression that terms like anxiety and depression are kind of semantic rather than real concepts that can be defined. Do you see how very offensive that could be to people with mental health problems?
So, if I can speak from the research that we have done around our model, and essentially not all young people have mental health needs, and I want to be really clear about that. Not all young offenders have mental health needs. Some do, and some young people do work with us for treatments around their mental health, and wherever possible, the Integrate model which we've developed advocates that it's not just about working with the individual, but it's also about working with some of the societal causes that might have attributed to the young person's difficulties. So what we advocate for is intervention at an individual level where it's necessary, and that intervention is led by what the young person wants support with, but also working at a more organisational level, because we recognise we can work with these young people till we're blue in the face, but if things around them don't change, then actually it's really challenging for some of these people to move forward with their lives.
And do you recognise a moral dilemma on the one hand, kind of providing an explanation for why people are very badly behaved and criminally behaved, and on the other hand, the need to instil in them a sense of self-responsibility? What do you actually do about that, the underpinning of self-responsibility?
So we're not saying that young people, it's that we're not saying that mental health difficulties cause young people to offend. There's not a link there. We're saying there are a group of young people who would find it challenging to access services. So they say things like, well, actually, I can't get to a clinic because it's in the wrong place. I don't feel safe to leave my postcode. Or there would be so much stigma with me seeking that help, I just can't go. But actually, perhaps I want some help, and can you come to me? So this is about reaching needs of young offenders on their terms in a way that's accessible to them in a highly flexible way.
Dr. Alcott, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. So, panel, let's go back to the man behind this report, Professor Layard, our first witness. Michael Portillo, you dragged him over this area of what you perceived to be, or suggested was, a self-definition of mental illness. What were you getting at, and to what extent did Lord Layard satisfy you on that score?
It didn't satisfy me. I thought there was a lack of rigour in how one defines what is a mental illness. I'm not for a moment denying that mental illness exists, or indeed denying that it's widespread. Personally, I find it difficult to believe that it's 6 million. I didn't find evidence from Lord Layard that it was 6 million, except apparently on the basis that people have been asked 26 questions. Well, I don't think 26 questions in which people detail their various unhappinesses is enough for me to be convinced. And then secondly, the main point that he seemed to be making was that a history of mental illness was the most likely predictor of people being unhappy in future. And again, I didn't like this conflation of mental illness on the one hand and unhappiness. I mean, unhappiness is the lot of many people, and there are very often very rational reasons why people are unhappy. As I understand it, mental illness, particularly depression and anxiety, are conditions which medics are very well able to identify, not least because of the intensity of those conditions, the crippling nature of those conditions.
Claire Fox?
I get really nervous about this because I think there's been this huge expansion of the diagnostic tools for intervention. You know, and there's every time anyone comes out now, there's a kind of new one on new syndromes that can be identified. The reason I get worried about it is I get concerned that there's a kind of advocacy research involved in this, which is people who passionately care about getting support and resources for the mentally ill. Kind of, the more that you can say there are, the more help. You know, it's always been a bit of an unglamorous one, schizophrenia and bipolar. Do you know what I mean? So if you can kind of broaden it out, so there's that rather cynical but well-intentioned thing. But there's also this sense in which I do worry that people, Lord Layard, think that those of us who are having a rough week or are rightly dissatisfied and unhappy with our lot because we live in a rubbish society or whatever, need to go and see a therapist. And I think the thing for me is just that, you know, people who suffer clinical depression, people who are about to go through an episode, or who are going through an episode, or people who have got bipolar or schizophrenia, you know, it's the most horrible experience. It's very nasty. They often don't present, and they certainly wouldn't answer, you know, you could answer the 26 questions and tell you everything was fine. I mean, people in the depths of depression often hide it.
Matthew Taylor, you were, Lord Layard, were very much concerned about the particularly social, political circumstances that might underlie mental illness or certainly depression. But didn't he make a telling point when he said, well, actually, looking back, the conditions and circumstances of people have changed beyond all measure, but people, if anything, I don't know how he measures it, but there you are, but people are probably less happy now than they were.
I think
Doesn't that achieve a disconnection that wasn't to your advantage?
I thought the most fascinating thing that Richard Layard said was that he was really arguing that mental illness, people used to say the poor are always with us, that mental illness is always with us, that there is always going to be a very high level of mental illness, what he would define as mental illness, a very high level. And it kind of begs the question, why, I don't want to be kind of reductionist, but why have we evolved as a race to have this incredibly high propensity to mental illness? Why would this have survived in the human gene with this kind of dysfunctionality? Now, I think that there are very specific causes of greater vulnerability in particular areas in society. I don't think, as our second speaker suggested, that it's simply about kind of grand power and class. I think there are very specific things going on, but I also cling on to the view, maybe I'm a naive idealist, but that a better society would be one where fewer people would be miserable.
Melanie?
Well, I think, I agree with quite a lot of what Matthew has said, and I do think that there is an increasing amount of social pressure upon people, which is leading to an increasing amount of what I would call illness. I thought that our second speaker, Dr. McLaughlin, was ludicrously reductionist. He seemed to be going out of his way to deny there was any such thing as illness, mental illness. Hang on just a minute, let me finish. He seemed to be going out of his way to deny there was a mental illness arising out of social problems. For example, his visceral reaction when I suggested that the mass fatherlessness that we're encountering was leading to real illness and disorder among children, produced this visceral reaction which I was accused of pathologizing single parenthood. But the fact is that if you talk to child psychiatrists, there is a huge amount of not just unhappiness among children, but an absolute disintegration of their identity from their abandonment, their feelings of abandonment, their neglect.
You made that point, Melanie.
What we had here was a real debate, because in passing, I think in response to my opening proposition, Lord Layard said that there were not incentives to misclassify conditions as mental illness that weren't mental illness. But I thought Dr. McLaughlin actually gave us all sorts of examples of the way in which that was happening and the reasons why it would happen. that it suits social agendas and political agendas and so on.
Well, he made several points, didn't he, that are worth reiterating, because they were assertions, fairly controversial and very interesting in this argument, that it was recasting morality as illness, for instance, that it was the medicalisation of bad behaviour and crime, and an encouragement to view ourselves as vulnerable.
But I think, one of the things that used to be the case that's changed is having a mental illness had a stigma attached to it. It was a horrible thing that you wanted to kind of get rid of, right? I mean, it wasn't fair. Now what's almost happened is kind of having a badge of, I'm in need of a therapeutic intervention is not that embarrassing. I mean, one of the things that teachers will tell you, and as a teacher I know it, is young people will come and say, don't you know I've got ADHD? Don't you know that I've got this deficit? And I'm ill, and I'm so on. I'm caricaturing, but not that much.
Well, of course.
Parents, of course, are now prepared to do that, and you can access both resources.
Yes.
But what's more is
that's another incentive.
You can access resources, but it's not just that.
It is the passport.
But you cannot. But it also becomes all these people then suddenly pay attention to you, right?
Isn't moral agency a real issue here in this, Matthew?
Yeah, absolutely, moral agency is an issue. But I also think that we need to explore why it is that certain groups of people appear to be more vulnerable, and why it is that certain kinds of pathologies seem to be on the rise. And whilst Melanie might disagree about what the causes are, I agree with her that one needs to look at those kind of slightly more granular connections. So the fact that, for example, we've got a problem with binge drinking and overeating is connected, from my view, about the things that people are encouraged to consume and the message of consumption which comes out of them. I don't think that's mental illness, though.
Nothing to do with mental illness at all.
Yeah, Melanie, that last witness, Dr. Alcock, is thoroughly admirable, going out onto the streets and mixing with gang members and everything. But did you not see there was a danger that it might encourage rather vicious and nasty people to see themselves as victims rather than perpetrators?
I thought that's what she was going to say, but she didn't actually say
didn't.
that. She went out of her way to say that wasn't what she was saying.
No, exactly.
So in all fairness to her, she was in favour of punishment, she was in favour of locking people up. I mean, I couldn't see quite where her argument was going. It seemed to be entirely worthy, but so what?
Michael? To quote West Side Story, dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you've got to understand, it's just our bringing upski that gets us out of hand.
I think there's a danger that what we are doing is we're in danger of making young people feel ill. If you keep telling them they're ill and they're dependent and they can't cope and they're not resilient and they've got this syndrome, that might empower them temporarily for a minute after they've been to their CBT. But ultimately, it means that they're not standing on their own 2 feet. And I think that's very dangerous.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. That's it for this week. From our panel, Melanie Phillips, Claire Fox, Michael Portillo, Matthew Taylor, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Burke, and the producer was Phil Peacom. And a reminder that you can get more information on how to download the Moral Maze from the Radio 4 website. It's time now for Forethought. Mitu Kandeka gives a personal view in front of an audience at the RSA in central London. The presenter is David Baddiel.
What do you think of when you think of computer games? Gore and violence, the haunted look of an adolescent boy who hasn't opened his curtains in 2 months? Does someone telling you they've reached level 7 on World of Warcraft make you assume they're probably a level 1 sex offender? Mitu Kandeka wants to make you think differently about computer games. A games designer herself and a PhD student in game design, she believes computer games present a wonderful opportunity to know ourselves. Mitu Kandeka.
I fell in love with video games when I was young, playing on various hand-me-down consoles from relatives. My favourite very early games were Paperboy or some forgotten Breakout clone on the Commodore 64. From there, I moved to the Sega